Friend of the show, Michael Shellenberger, was on Capitol Hill yesterday testifying to a DHS oversight committee about the widespread and repeated instances of government censorship. Here's a little bit of Shellenberger's testimony.
Close by saying, if you set aside for a moment the Orwellian aspects of CISA's efforts at mind control, what do we think the consequences could be of CISA taking its eye off the cybersecurity ball so it can crusade with Stanford interns against wrongthink? Should we be able to sleep soundly at night knowing that CISA is focused on the problem of people being wrong on the internet rather than on China, Russia, Iran, and other malicious actors seeking to harm American businesses, government agencies, and our citizens? What's at stake here is our fundamental freedom to express our views on controversial social and political issues without fear of government censorship. Thank you very much.
Now, in a thread on X, Shellenberger posted the whole of his testimony, arguing that while the U.S. Department of Homeland Security says it didn't censor the American people, it actually did. The department used front groups to mask its censorship as cybersecurity. DHS thus violated the Constitution to undermine national security.
Here to discuss that hearing alongside other government censorship issues is Michael Shellenberger. Michael, welcome back to Rising.
Thanks for having me.
So you're visiting our town frequently now. I know it's just to spend more time with me and Brianna, but you also had an official mission here on Congress, before Congress once again.
Yeah, it was a little bit more tame this week than it was 2 weeks ago. This is the committee that oversees the Department of Homeland Security. And the question is, what should be done about all this evidence of censorship by this particular agency, the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency? I believe that given what it's done, it should be abolished. And if there's good cybersecurity work happening in it, should be reconstituted under different leadership in a different department. There's obviously a lot of pushback against that from the supporters of it. But I think the hearing got at some really important questions around what was the government actually doing with these groups that were demanding censorship? To what extent was this just private groups, or do they actually have the blessing of the Department of Homeland Security? We think the evidence is very overwhelming. I mean, you saw the head of this agency, CISA, actually blessing the first of these groups, which was the Cyber Threat Intelligence League. And then, of course, they were intimately involved with the Election Integrity Project and with the Virality Project out of Stanford and other think tanks. So what you basically had is what they called censorship laundering, or sort of censorship by proxy. And we know from the Supreme Court rulings in the past that if the government is prevented from doing something, it can't then go and create a proxy to do it for it. I would also note that just in the world of intelligence and spies and all of that, everybody knows from Hollywood that often what you're doing is you're creating front groups to do things under some different banner. You're not doing it directly as the Department of Homeland Security. You're doing it through Stanford, or you're doing it through someone else. So I think what you see here is a much more complex picture of the censorship industrial complex, but really at the root of it comes from the Department of Homeland Security.
So speaking of complexity, you posted a kind of chart on Twitter trying to, I think, walk the public through and really help them to understand how this mechanism worked. Can you try to unpack that for us a little bit here?
Well, this is, so Matt Taibbi had done a FOIA request to Stanford, and they finally released these documents. It was only earlier this week. I thought Matt had sort of buried the lead a little bit. I was like, this graphic really shows everything. Stanford Internet Observatory had denied that it was demanding takedown requests from the social media platforms. But when you look at the lower right-hand corner of that graphic, it says, here we are forwarding the information to platforms for takedowns. So it's very clearly that they were advocating censorship. They were making these demands. I think the other thing is that there's a question, one of the arguments that our opponents make is they say that the government wasn't coercing this. They were just suggesting it, recommending it. But when you look at the larger context, you had President Biden saying that Facebook was killing people. You had members of Congress demanding that Section 230, which is the license basically for these social media platforms to operate. You saw a huge amount of pressure on the social media companies really from 2016 up until today in that context. And you had the Department of Homeland Security saying, hey, these folks here at Stanford are the ones advocating this. It's hard not to see that as a broader play to coerce the social media platforms into censorship.
So we could either, basically there are two ways we could resolve this. So I agree with you. It seems like censorship to me. It seems like a First Amendment violation to me. But it is a little bit ambiguous, as you say, because it's being done by proxy, and sometimes it's under the veneer that it's a suggestion and not a requirement,
right.
and the threat is not we're going to put you in jail, but rather we're going to change the regulation to hurt you, or we're going to embarrass you in other ways, but it's not, they didn't literally arrest people, so it doesn't violate it in the most hard and obvious way. So we could resolve this in two directions. Either we could have a legislative solution where Congress could just pass a bill that says, well, regardless of what the First Amendment says, we're directing government officials not to do this, or we're shutting down the agencies that do that. Or you could have a Supreme Court decision, which we hope might come from the Missouri case, where the Supreme Court says, yes, it violates the First Amendment. This XYZ in combination does, and maybe this doesn't, but this does, that sort of thing. So what is more likely, do you think, at this point?
Oh, gosh, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously we're hoping for a victory in Missouri v. Biden, but even there, even if you have a victory, then they have to make recommendations of what can and cannot be done. And then I still think there's a role for Congress here no matter what. I think one thing I've always thought, and we still continue to believe, is the importance of transparency. So I think there should be some requirement that if governments are asking for the social media platforms to do something, that they should have to report that instantaneously so it gets reported. I think the other line that you would just draw is you can say, because some of the people say, well, the government officials have a right to speak and to express their own views. Of course, we agree with that. In this case, though, they were demanding that things be taken down.
Right.
And the First Amendment is very clear about that. I would also note that the First Amendment, it doesn't say the government shall not use coercion to censor people. It says the government shall not limit speech. And so anything that's aimed at that, whether it's partnering or just hanging out with or being friendly with, all those things are violations of the First Amendment. So for me, if the government has some criticism of what's on a social media platform or some concern, they should just say so publicly. There was one of the examples gave at the hearing yesterday is, what about people giving wrong information about when the day of the election is? That's very simple. It means you go and respond to that person and you go, this is wrong. I am the Kansas election board, and the proper date of the election is this date. It's counter speech. And so I think in some ways, that's what's so striking about it, is that there's some sense in the culture, but in these institutions, that wrong information is that the right solution to it is to just remove it from society. We see it everywhere, right, including on the Israel-Palestine issue, as opposed to just speaking back to it, and that goes for hate speech. I think people think about, there's Nazis on Twitter, or there's Nazis on X. Well, in fact, there's now an attack on Substack. There's Nazis on Substack. Well, that's great, because that means we can go and argue with them, and we can explain why Nazism is horrible, and we can remind new generations of kids can learn why fascism is bad. If you suppress that and you censor it, then there's no opportunity for that dialogue. And so I think this is a kind of a consequence of the rising intolerance and coddling that says, we shouldn't have to hear divergent views or horrible views. The long tradition in the United States is for horrible views to be expressed precisely so we can speak back to them.
Michael, that's part of why this is so tough. You bring up the Israel-Palestine example. In your earlier example, you talked about how, the government might not specifically be directing X, Y, and Z, but there's this mirroring between the statements that are coming out of the President of the United States and members of Congress and what's happening on social media platforms, in addition to these proxy agencies making requests. They might not be demands, but they are requests with the clear backing of the sentiment of the government. We're talking Israel-Palestine. Obviously, we have the President of the United States saying, Israel has our unimpeachable support. We're sending them the weapons that are being used in the bombing campaign against Gaza. At the same time, you have Congress passing resolutions to censor the only Palestinian-American congresswoman. You have them passing resolutions to say anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. You see the Republican House holding a hearing to bring Harvard College students and other college students above them to talk about their feelings of being safe on campus, without a similar interest in the 3 Palestinian-American students who were shot in Vermont, one of whom is paralyzed now from the chest down, probably for the rest of his life. And at the same time, you have Elon Musk, the head of the app, taking a trip to Israel, coming back and seeming to pivot on his position on this issue, saying that if you engage in speech and say a statement like "from the river to the sea," which is disputed, obviously people have different feelings about what that means,
right,
you will be suspended from the app. So where do you direct your focus then? Is it really about what Joe Biden is saying? Is it really something that constraining the government's actions will fix if you have the actual richest person in the world who happens to own this social media app also seemingly submitting to the persuasion of a head of state that isn't even our own head of state?
Well, it's amazing. I mean, you give so many examples there. So you see the temptation to demand censorship, whether it's in a context of it being the government or the private sector, just setting that aside for now, this demand to censor, this desire to get rid of speech rather than engage in counter speech, something's broken in the culture and I think in our spirit. I mean, this is not how it was in the 90s, when I was growing up, or the 80s, where, the left defended flag burning, and we defended the left defended the right of Nazis to march through a neighborhood of Holocaust survivors. That just seems like we were tougher back then. And now it's like, are there people saying horrible things on Harvard campus? Yes. Is there a chance to speak back to them? Yes, there should be. Of course there should be. The idea that this constant impulse to want to shut down speech rather than add to it, it's bizarre. I think it speaks to something kind of really broken in us. Maybe it's something that comes out of social media culture. I mean, I think I would argue the intolerance and the coddling are two sides of the same coin here. But yeah, I think we saw it obviously with the demand of the presidents of Harvard disallow certain statements rather than allowing more free speech on campus. I agree with you, about from the river to the sea. Of course, that should be allowed to be debated on X, and that's such a good example too, because it's a case where the meaning itself is uncertain. And one of the things that's always bothered us about this, we've described how they were hiding censorship as a cybersecurity issue. And cybersecurity issues you're dealing with mechanics. It's something is true or false, black or white. It's a 1 or a 0. When you're dealing with language, in the whole history of philosophy for hundreds of years has dealt with the ambiguity of meaning, that things that I mean to say, you hear them differently than I do. And the only way we know to resolve that, going back to Socrates, is through dialogue. And so it makes me sad that there's that we've lost sight of that power of this really basic part of Western culture, Western civilization, which is dialogue, and instead of resorting to this much more primitive, I think, barbaric view, which we just have to shut down people before they have a chance to speak. Let me say one other thing about this, because it's really sparked a lot of my thinking on this, is that, in the older times, the king could arrest you or kill you or hang you for things that you said. We get to the United States and we say it's not up to the government to decide what's true or false. It's not the arbiter of the truth. Things move so much faster when you don't have to get permission from the king for what you can say. When you have very few limits on freedom of speech, it means that you can communicate. So when something's going wrong in the society, hey, maybe it turns out that kids don't need to take the vaccine, or maybe cloth masks don't work. When that information is allowed to flow freely rather than flow through a central committee of bureaucrats to decide whether or not it's safe to say those things, we're able to self-correct so much faster. We can change our minds so much more quickly. So anyway, it's funny. I find myself making these kind of school of rock, very simple points about freedom of speech, but it feels like this is a moment that we need to come back to the basics of why exactly our founders created the system they did.
So very important, so wise. Thank you, Michael Shellenberger, for being with us here. We always appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, guys.
More Rising right after this.